So the first book we're going to hear about is published on Palgrave Macmillan. It's edited by my colleague Leandros Fischer, assistant professor at Aalborg University and part of DEMOS. The title of the book is the Crisis-Mobility Nexus, and it came out in February, or late January, February this year. Leandros will do a presentation of the book and sort of highlight some aspects of it. We also have one contributor to the book who wrote a chapter together with Leandros, Jafar Alul, if I pronounce it correctly, who's assistant professor in cultural anthropology at Utrecht University. So Jafar will give like a presentation based on a specific chapter. And those two presentations hopefully will give an impression of the first book. The second book is titled Contending Global Apartheid, Transversal Solidarities and Politics of Possibility. It is edited by Carl-Ulrik Schierup, also here, and myself, originally published on Brill in late 21, but as I said, it came out on Haymarket publishers in November last year. Carl-Ulrik will present the overall idea of the book and give a presentation of what it was we were focusing on at the time when we wrote it. And Ana Santanarina Guerrero, also difficult for a Nordic guy to pronounce, who's a postdoctoral researcher at UNED in Madrid, will do a presentation of one of the chapters and perhaps bring it up to date. So 4 presentations, each about 15 minutes. If you speak more than that, I'm going to ask you to wrap up. Because we also have a commentator I'm very happy to see here as well, Professor Bridget Anderson, Professor of Migration, Mobilities and Citizenship at the School of Sociology, Politics and International Studies at Bristol University. I guess all of us, all of you know Bridget's work, which has been informative for many of the discussions we have in our books as well. So we really appreciate you taking the time to comment on these presentations and so on. So pleased to see you here. So the program is, as I already said, we will do 4 presentations. First, starting out with the Crisis-Mobility Nexus, having presentations by Leandros and Jafar. And then we go directly to 2 presentations from Contending Global Apartheid by Carl-Ulrik and Anna. And then we do like a super short bio break, get a cup of coffee, 5 minutes, and then we have Bridget comment on presentations and your general impression of what you know of the books and so on. Any time left, we can use for questions, discussions, comments, whatever. We will end at 16, the latest, so we have about 2 hours in all. So again, nice to see you all, and I'm going to in the chat section. I'm going to drop some links for the books and also for our 2 collaborating institutions, REMESO at Linköping University, where Carl-Ulrik is part of as a professor emeritus, and the DEMOS research group at Aalborg University. Enough from me. So I would like to pass over the words and the screen, likely, to you, Kelly. Oh, sorry, we start out with the Crisis-Mobility. Sorry, Leandros, you're on. Apologies.
Thank you very much. I haven't prepared a PowerPoint presentation because of the shortness of time. But it's always difficult to speak of your own work in a way. But I will try in the next 15 minutes, hopefully less, to speak about the book, about how the idea for the book came from, and what I would consider to be its contributions to current debates. So I would say that I started thinking about the interconnections between crisis and mobility sometime around during the pandemic, actually. And I think it was a quite strange time for a lot of people. But what I do remember was that when the pandemic started, it was sort of conceived as this novel crisis, and that was sort of the framing that was going around. And there were two things that I had personally observed. The first one was that, well, for people already in a precarious status, like irregularized migrants, the pandemic itself wasn't something new, in the sense that there were always mobility restrictions for these groups, and it created a new additional dimension in the context of especially the very securitized European border regime. So I felt it was pretty difficult for me to assimilate this framing that this has been like a completely new thing and something completely unheard of and something novel. It was quite obvious, I think, from the beginning that what had happened in 2020 was pretty much class racialized, and the second thing that I personally observed was that there was a very slight taste of optimism at the beginning of the pandemic, especially within social movements that took the crisis of the state to be of the underfunded health systems to be an opportunity for movements to substitute the state and sort of call for a more humane society when the pandemic ends. And there were all these examples. I lived most of my time in Hamburg in Germany, and I remember how residents in my building, including myself, were offering our services to vulnerable people like the elderly or others that couldn't do their own shopping to do that. So there was kind of this idea that now that the pandemic crisis has shown the limits of neoliberalism, that we are somehow enacting the state from below. And around a year later, that feeling completely disappeared. And what I found very strange was that, it wasn't strange, but it appeared as a paradox that those same social forces that actually were for more restrictions when it came to the movement of refugees and migrants started taking up the mantle of free movement and freedom. And you had all these movements, COVID denialist movements, declaring themselves to be fighting the state and all of those things. I also felt a bit unsatisfied about some of the explanations that try to reduce everything to a question of on the one hand science and rationality and the good state, and on the other hand this sort of irrational mob. And I kind of felt that what had happened during COVID was pretty much interconnected with the broader crisis of legitimacy that you have in Western liberal democracies. And it was also something that was visible during events like the so-called Summer of Migration in 2015. And, there was obviously, I felt that there was a gap in connecting all of those crises together and showing how they are entangled with the politics of mobility. So I do not claim that this book is offering a novel theoretical paradigm, but there was an crisis in mobility beyond very obvious elements like deportation policies. I would situate the book within a broader genre of literature that seeks to conceptualize everything that has happened since the financial crisis in 2008 as somehow interconnected. There are some authors like Adam Tooze who use the concept of polycrisis to refer the so-called refugee crisis, the Eurozone crisis, and all of that. But I would say that the theoretical paradigm in the book goes one step further in trying to conceptualize all these crises not have their origins in the big structural crisis of capitalism that has been underway since the late 2000s and hasn't really, in my opinion, been resolved. Then, of course, there's a question of tying that to mobility. And again, I'm not claiming any originality here in saying that I'm the first scholar to have linked those two concepts. I pay tribute, in fact, to another book that came out, I think, some 5 or 6 years ago by Mimi Schiller called Mobility Justice, in where she speaks of a triple crisis of mobility. She approaches the crisis of mobility in 3 specific ways, dealing, for example, with public transportation. I can say that I found some inspiration in the concept to actually develop this book. I am briefly going to talk about some of the not some of the chapters. I mean, it's only 7 chapters, but briefly present them. After the introduction of where I actually write about the theorizations of crisis and mobility, Martin, who is presenting this session, has a chapter on the deportation regime, which is to some extent based on our research we did together at the DEMOS project some years ago, where he also shows the effects that the COVID pandemic had on the politics. Deportation is not a simple set of policies, but it's something that is entangled with the wider politics of racialization within Western societies. And he speaks at length about the Windrush generation in Great Britain. The following chapter is me and Martin talking about mobility regimes on the urban scale, which is also based on some of the work we have done in Athens and Hamburg, in showing how there are different types of mobility that condition that determine the success or failure of urban citizenship efforts on the local scale. The next chapter, which Jafar will talk about, is about the interconnections between social mobility and geographical mobility, but also racialization and class making, based on 2 examples in Dubai and Cyprus. There is a chapter on the politics of COVID-19 related social mobilization, in which I make the case that the main contradiction that arose during the pandemic was not so much between the binary of complete freedom on the one hand and social control / responsibility, but was between forces that promoted solidarity within society, like, for example, the movements that helped vulnerable people during the pandemic, and on the other hand, movements that promoted what I call desolidarization, whether we're talking about COVID negationist movements, but also governments that cynically used the pandemic to curb mobility and also to enforce authoritarian regimes home. The last chapter deals with 2 aspects of the crisis which are not being dealt with in other chapters. One of them is the ongoing environmental crisis, which is a more incremental process. And the other one is the war in Ukraine, where we've seen quite a contradiction in the way that some mobilities, in this case, Ukrainian refugee mobilities, were treated in public discourse and in European policy from what we had during 2015, where the talk was of a breakdown of European solidarity. Finally, I'm going to try to keep this short. I think that I would say that one of the things that I try to show in this book, well, not just me, but also the contributing authors, was the malleability of the concept of solidarity, and how in many cases the word solidarity gets used and abused and ends up producing outcomes that are detrimental for social equality and justice. One example was that during the so-called refugee crisis between 2013 and 2015, there was a lot of talk of a breakdown of European solidarity because a lot of countries would not take in refugees. And the way that the question was framed was one of collective burden sharing, and that already laid the foundations for this opposition between welfare on the one hand and free movement on the other. Then you had during the pandemic, a lot of governments started talking about solidarity themselves, but what they actually meant was social cohesion. And it was a framing of solidarity that in the end individualized the causes of the pandemic and the virus and created false divisions between, those who were vaccinated and those who were not, thus deflecting from the failures, the structural failures of neoliberalism in exacerbating the effects of the pandemic. And lastly, we have, in the case of the war in Ukraine, again, this talk of European solidarity, which obviously has quite exclusionary connotations towards the rest of the world, and is again, I would say, a distorted notion of solidarity being employed from above in all of this crisis that we are witnessing in the past 10 years. And what I plead, and I think this is where this edited volume speaks very much to the one that will be presented afterwards, is I plead for a contentious attitude towards solidarity as one that is not merely synonymous with social cohesion and not rocking the boat, but one that is actively striving to create social alliances between different marginalized groups in society. And this is how I end, actually, we can only develop, in my opinion, this notion of contentious solidarity if we have a clear understanding about how all of this crisis that we have been experiencing for the past decade are not just contingent on one another, but are actually quite interconnected and quite organically linked, and have their origins actually in the same structural crisis of capitalism that has been underway for a decade. So obviously, yes, we can say that the book utilizes a Gramscian approach. We all know the famous quote about this being the time of monsters, and I would say that its social contribution is also to help us a bit conceptualize all these developments as being pretty much interlinked. And I think there is a certain attitude in scholarship of utilizing a crisis and making this the new next big thing. And you had a lot of scholarship on populism, and then you had a lot of scholarship on the refugee crisis, and then you had a lot of scholarship on the pandemic. But I think the real challenge here is actually show how everything is bound together. So I think I hope this gave an adequate overview of what the book is about. You can probably judge from yourselves instead of listening to me raving about it. So I would end my presentation and give the floor to Jafar, who will say some things about the ideas behind our common chapter in the book.
Thanks, Leandros. And all over to you, Jafar.
All right. Thank you very much for convening this presentation and also for inviting me to contribute to the book, Leandros. It was a pleasure to write up our chapter, which goes by the title, Dubai and Cyprus as Geographies of Social Mobility Between Europe and the Middle East. And I think, so I'll skirt around certain ideas, elements of contribution to the field of mobility studies, migration studies, but also in general, the social science that deals with notions of migration, but also, as Leandros in the end pointed out, this idea of having to study the exceptional, because what we also did was look at middle classes and middle class formation, or the aspiration to be middle class, or the fear to downclass, as a more, I would say, consistent theme in social science, but one that has been snowed under relatively to a large extent in migration and mobility studies. There's not that much focus on social class anymore, especially in anthropological circles. But we did find it important to relate this notion of a middle class making in migration, but also then how that relates to native populations and their anxieties, and tie that into the whole debate about crisis. And we tried to do so by focusing on two case studies that maybe look exceptional for Dubai, because it's a geography positioned outside of Europe, but very much connected and integrated into Western capitalism, basically. And I specifically have studied expats, Western expats, leaving Europe for various reasons to take on a position as the managerial class in the Gulf. And Leandros looked at Cyprus as a geography, again, in some way, a sort of liminal zone that we perceive today as a hard border, but if you dig a bit deeper, has been connected to both Europe and the Eastern Mediterranean, the Middle East, for a very long time, especially through social histories. And we tried to look specifically, in Leandros' case, at Lebanese immigrants of a middle class background going to Cyprus, and try to recreate and reproduce certain status positions, basically, economically, but also racially, when they come into the new social formation that they would like to call home. We also try to draw out some links between these places, Dubai, Cyprus, that might not be on the radar, but as Leandros also wrote, during the 70s, a lot of Cypriot engineers went to the Gulf countries to basically service a middling position in the technical field, and as such also circulated in this neo-colonial British spaces, and brought with them all these ideas of new racial stratification in the labor market, and also kind of imputed them into Cypriot consciousness, especially class consciousness. What we tried to do was not so much do conceptual work. We tried to see how the concept that I've tried to draw out in my earlier work on racial capital, sort of a Bourdieusian form of capital, could be operationalized in our two case studies, and what that sort of says about the state of mobility and migration in both places. In my case, I looked at Europeans born and raised in Europe, in France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, of Maghrebi North African heritage, tertiary educated, well-positioned, and who then leave for Dubai. And just by virtue of moving to another social space, basically almost overnight get allotted a different racial status. And that shift was so radical in my empirical data, not just in the sense that a certain stigma of being associated with Muslimness, being Muslim, or of North African heritage was suddenly annulled or rendered neutral. It was actually a lot of positive cultural capital that they could draw on to their liking strategically. So many of the people I spoke to would say, I'm actually astonished by the fact that here I am first and foremost European, because I'm technically skilled and trained in Europe. I have European citizenship and they pay me as a European in the job market, but also that, to mention that I am Arab or Muslim, and this even goes for people who are secular, would actually give them so many benefits professionally and economically. So that sort of paradox, we try to see how it plays out also in Cyprus, and then draw out some takeaways. I do think we've explored certain similarities, and one key takeaway, and I think we could have maybe developed this more, or this is something that we could develop in the future, is that the Gulf countries in general, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, the Emirates, are always exceptionalized as this place of modern slavery, with the infamous kafala system of sponsorship, with people coming in, being exploited, and then rotated out. But in fact, if you look at the whole migration regime, including in Europe, including refugees or different status holders for subsidiary protection, but also working class migrants from the Indian subcontinent, and you look at places like Cyprus, you see that these states are also nowadays trying to perfect a system of transit, a system of exploitation, whereby the access to citizenship is no longer even at stake. It's almost natural and normal to think that these people come and go and they service a certain need, and there is a win-win situation, supposedly. So this system of modern slavery, as it is often depicted in popular media portrayals of the Gulf, is a much larger system globally, which we know also if we look at history and indentured labor, but which is also playing out in European states today, and particularly in Cyprus, but also in places like Malta. We see all these new schemes, and we see a lot of exchange and also inspiration that these countries actually draw from Gulf countries. And the same can be said about Gulf countries looking to places like Singapore, where they kind of mimic a new model of the development to deal with modes of crises. And I do think by doing so, by looking at these quote unquote extreme examples of migrant inclusion and exclusion in sort of neoliberal dystopias, especially in Dubai, you also start seeing the contradictions in relation to this notion of solidarity that Leandros also pointed out. And we mentioned a few of them, that people that are basically racialized and outcast in Europe, when they go to a place where overnight they're almost on top of the stratification system, they basically co-produce new forms of oppression, and that actually even complicates further the notion of solidarity that we today grapple with. I do want to mention that I think the contribution of the chapter is interesting and maybe inspiring, because especially in the field of migration studies in Europe, I think there's been a lot of very fascinating work in the subdomain of refugee studies, but I do think there's a not so justifiable overemphasis on all things downtrodden, all things refugees, And as such, you have an almost a navel gazing moment in migration studies, where if we don't look at the larger picture of also Europeans going abroad, and this has been a historical trend also, Europe as a staging ground for mobilities, either downtrodden, European downtrodden publics going to the new worlds, or today to engage in expatriate making, in class making abroad, overseas, accumulating capital and returning. So if we don't expand the analytical gaze of migration, I think we might fall into the trap of exceptionalizing Europe and also treating it as an eternal endpoint for global mobility. So I do think in our detailed ethnographies there is something there which provides a bit of a fresh look, and I'll leave it there. Hopefully there's some questions also that we can address if need be. Thank you.
Your microphone, Martin.
Yeah, I found out. So thank you. With these two presentations, we leave the first book and move to the second one, Contending Global Apartheid. And I'll ask you, Carl-Ulrik, to do the first presentation of the book overall.
Thank you, Martin. I have a PowerPoint I want to share. We'll see if it works. It seems that it does. So anyway, let me start by saying that global apartheid is a product of a collective endeavor, and it was a really great experience for Martin and myself to work on this project with a group of excellent and very inspiring scholars. In our introduction to the volume, Martin and I speak about the book as a plea for utopia in a deeply divisive present that has been called neo-apartheid. It is a message that is embodied in a collection of essays on solidarity movements, sanctuary spaces, and the emplacement of anti-racist commonalities in cities across North and South America, Europe, and Africa. The idea is that a contradictory reality of the segregated neo-apartheid city may also accommodate transformative possibilities. Let's see. Let me see if I can make this work. Yeah, it does. So I just wanted to say that the title of the volume actually paraphrases what Anthony B. Richards in his book spoke about. He spoke about the title of his book is Global Apartheid, Refugees, Racism, and the New World Order. That was our sort of inspiration for the title. And his book was published in 1994, and that's the very year when South African apartheid, the apartheid regime of racial capitalism, finally caved in. But at that very historical junction, Richards argues, a global apartheid had already become the reality of a new emerging world order. It was demonstrating that a global dystopia was marked by an upsurge in racism, discrimination, intolerance, and xenophobia, with neo-Nazi extremism gaining ground, and by a proliferation of technologies for confinement of uprooted masses in contemporary concentration camps. It was, he stated, moreover, a fair new world of iron curtains, armed guards, and computer surveillance systems. It's sort of, I think we recognize all of that. So, but he was an optimist, Richard. No, he believed that the global apartheid was deemed to fail, just like the racial regimes of South Africa before. So, and yet, we found that his judgment appears even more true of our contemporary world of walled states. Now, 30 years later, we can speak about an expropriative regime, of global regime, actually, of displacement, dispossession, forced migration, and super exploitation. Certainly, it mostly institutionalizes discrimination by other means than explicit racist legislation, although this also is on the board, on the table, of course. So, Contending Racial Global Apartheid explores this contemporary reality of neo-apartheid and movements of resistance that it is giving rise to. The book seeks options for politics of solidarity, remigrancy, asylum, and urban conviviality in focus. This actualizes a continuous need for knowledge on social, economic, and political conditions that frames the idea of solidarity as a force for change. It demands a reimagining of places and spaces of resistance and variable social forces for the development of transformative politics. In this endeavor, in the book, a central concept is that of transversal solidarity. This was elaborated as a concept in anti-racist feminist theory by Nira Yuval Davis. She phrases it in terms of breaching a common epistemological understanding across differences. Since the idea has been important for rethinking contemporary social movements, it has been phrased shorthand by David Featherstone in terms of collective struggles across differences, positionalities, and hierarchies, and with the potential to create new forms of spaces, subjectivities, and social relations. Using transversal solidarity as a generic concept, Contending Global Apartheid explores multiple cases of the interplay of structural contingencies and social movements, of identity and agency, of the social versus the institutional, and the local versus the national, the regional, and the global. This triangle illustrates some of the complexity in exploring the formation of transversal solidarities. There are these three dimensions of identity, space, and space scale and organization. They all inhabit inherent dichotomies. And if we follow up on the last one, on that about in a second triangle, that of the third dimension of organization, along a scale of institutionalization, then it spans from autonomous movements keeping an arm's length from states and institutions to a condition of institutionalization with, for example, municipalities as central and defining agents. So to the content of the book. Contending Global Apartheid is divided into three main thematic parts. I don't think you see the whole of it here. Yeah, right. Part one elaborates transversal solidarity and politics of scale theoretically and illustrated by some paradigmatic empirical cases. Part two proceeds from the concept of emplacement. It opens for alternative understandings of the formation of transversal commonalities that are rooted in the formation of local urban strongholds of resistance. These are commons that may be fixed and durable, but also mobile and transient. Part three of the book locates what we call politics of possibility through notions such as sanctuary or solidarity cities. It discusses constellations and alliances between social movements, NGOs, and municipalities and cities across Latin America and Europe. The book's 14 chapters rethink complex realities and explore politics and possibilities through empirical case studies and through conceptual and theory development. They draw upon a case material from cities in urban North and South America, Africa, and Europe. To part one, which is introduced by a chapter by Harold Border, quite a fundamental one. He departs in his work from basic philosophical ideas of solidarity, sort of classical ideas, mainly European ones. He discusses how their different premises are reflected in a variability of urban agency in solidarity with precarious migrants and refugees. Very different, as it were. Very different sort of models of modes of solidarity. The next chapter by Oscar Garcia Agustin and Martin Bach. I think I spelled Oscar's name wrongly. Martin Bach, it explores and develops concepts of transversal solidarity, space and scale. It is illustrated by cases of alliance making that traverses city, nation, and the wider international order. Then there are two chapters by Elspeth de Groot and Shannon Gleason and by Janet Monnekamp that spotlight the role of trade unions in particular. They focus on problems and potentials of coalition building for migrant rights between trade unions, migrant organizations, and municipalities in respectively Seattle and Houston and in Johannesburg. Then part two, that starts up by a chapter by Lauren Landau and Irian Fremantle. They offer an analysis of, as they phrase it, everyday informal means of establishing rights to space in inhospitable places. The context is mixed migrant communities in Nairobi and Johannesburg. Other chapters investigate cases of a focused but open-ended contestative place building. A chapter on Stockholm by Ilan Kelejolo, Alexandra Ålund, and myself explores the reinvention of the old Swedish working class institution of the People's House. We discuss its revival as an anti-racist community center traversing ethnicity, face, and gender in neo-apartheid metropolis Stockholm. Then Ana Santamarina's chapter, it discusses the emplacement of anti-fascist neighborhood struggles in Madrid. Anna will tell us more about that in a minute, I think. And then there's a truly heretic chapter, I would say, on the mobile placemaking of France's yellow vests. It's written by Christophe Foultier. He questions prevailing media and governmental stigmatizing of that movement as an unruly, far-right, reactionary white trash revolt. And he traces wavering links of that movement to France's racialized banlieue, which is sort of pioneering. Then part three. Here, Margaret Godoy and Harold Border introduced by surveying the Latin American state of solidarity formation and compare it to migration governance and activist solidarity in Europe and North America. They explore the role of civil society in engaging municipal policies and practices of solidarity in Santiago during the COVID-19 pandemic in their second chapter in this section. Then about Morales Cardiel's chapter, he investigates emergent solidarities under conditions of US imperialism, community emergency, and forced migration across and in Mexico. He explores the key role of social Catholicism in coalition building in the sort of Paulo Freire tradition. The volume is rounded up by 2 chapters by Ilka Atak in collaboration with respectively Kim Rügel and Maurice Stier, and with Sarah Schillinger. It explores the complex formation of solidarity, or they do, in the 2 chapters, explore the complex formation of solidarity activism for and with illegalized migrants across urban Europe. The 2 chapters discuss the positionality of undocumented migrants and the formation of inclusive welfare structures. And I mean, processes carried by networks and alliances that actually reach out to urban authorities in the process. Then in some, before handing over to Anna, Contending global apartheid challenges a fierce global reality with empirical descriptions, conceptual and theoretical reflections. With migrancy, asylum, and urban conviviality in focus, the book investigates a multitude of politics of possibility as a challenge to global apartheid. The authors seek potentials of transversal solidarities in cities of the world with a bottom-up as well as a top-down perspective. Through this, they or we retrieve a multitude of what we may call realizable utopias. So let me, in that kind of spirit, finish by repeating that a couple of main resources of inspiration has been Richard's Global Apartheid, the work on transversal solidarity by Nira Yuval Davis, but I will not forget then Ernst Bloch's seminal work, The Principle of Hope. And I suggest that we could return to this perspective in the discussion. So.
Thank you very much.
What do you see as the conditionality and materiality of hope today? That should be a question to you all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Carl-Ulrik. Then we have the last presentation in this round by you, Anna.
Hi, I'm going to share my screen as well. So, wait. So, let me see if I can make it. Can you see this?
Yes, but not in slides mode, or what do you call it?
Okay. Now?
Yes.
Okay. So, hello everyone. I'm Ana. I'm now a postdoctoral researcher in the Universidad Nacional de Educación a Distancia in Spain, in a research group on critical urban studies. And I'm going to present the chapter that I published within this second volume. We were talking before about a continuum of crisis. I think one of the most important outcomes of this continuum of crisis has been the rise of, far-right politics and far-right populisms worldwide, shaping what we were framing before as the global apartheid. And my chapter is basically about this. I address the spatial elements of far-right mobilization, exploring the local and everyday dimensions of the political strategies and discourses of the far-right party vox in Madrid, and also raising important debates on neighborhood solidarity and anti-fascist politics, which I think are crucial in order to challenge the political scenario that we have been living over the past years. In terms of the outline of my presentation, I'm going to follow the structure of the chapter. I will start with some introduction of my theoretical interventions on debates on the spaces of far-right politics. Then I will introduce Vox as the main kind of case study I'm addressing in the chapter. And then I will discuss the everyday dimensions of the political strategies of Vox, and also what this means in terms of anti-fascist struggles. So starting with the theoretical kind of part, the significant proliferation of far-right politics and xenophobic populisms during the last years has attracted a growing academic attention. Pushing forward a spatial analysis to these politics, my theoretical intervention criticized that almost all the literature on far-right politics focuses on the nation-state and institutional politics as the natural objects of political analysis, missing the everyday spaces of socio-political reproduction. I argue that such hegemonic perspective overlooks the generative role of space in producing political positions and feelings, as well as the quotidian conditions, consequences, and processes underpinning the politics of hate. Thus, through looking at the spaces where far-right politics actually take place and are mobilized, I make the following interventions. Firstly, I highlight how the far-right builds its success through the politicization of everyday inequalities and spaces of hardship, paying attention to the situated dimensions of far-right mobilizations. Secondly, I foreground the co-constitutive relationship between institutional politics and the politics of the street. Thirdly, I discuss how the spatial inequalities that are mobilized by the far right are shaped by institutional racism and the direct production of everyday xenophobia and exclusion by sovereign powers. Fourthly, I argue that the far right needs to be situated both historically and geographically, and I basically contend that the political geographies of a specific place are key to understand the practice and strategies of the far right, as well as the construction of anti-fascist alternatives. And finally, I criticize that most of the existing literature on far right is merely descriptive, and it doesn't address the question of anti-fascism. And I argue that this spatial analysis has also important implications for the articulation of anti-fascist politics on the ground. And a core argument in my work, which I have been developing in recent work, is basically that the neighborhood is a key scale for intervention where anti-fascist politics become crucial. I argue that as a key scale of political socialization, the neighborhood holds the potential to build solidarities and politics of belonging alternative to those of the state and the far right, basically. So from these theoretical notes, I move on to an analysis of Vox. I'm going to be very brief here, but basically Vox became the third political force in the Spanish parliament after the 2019 national elections. They have gained increasing importance in political debates, and well, they got worse results in the last elections, fortunately, but they have been a key actor within Spanish politics since the last 5 years. I argue that Vox far-right politics have 3 key overlapping mainstays. ultranationalism, racism, and anti-feminism, or to put it better, three key enemies: migrants, feminists, and Catalans. I address how this anti-Spain is deeply embedded in the long-term histories of Francoism and the Spanish Civil War. So here, for example, on the screen, you have this image from Aragorn of the Lord of the Rings fighting all the evils of the country. Here, you also have like propaganda that the party place put in the subway of Madrid, also signaling all the evils of the country, the migrant minors, multiculturalism, illegal migration, the migrant invasion, and so on and so forth. In abstract terms, these elements can be common to other nationalists of far-right ideologies in Western Europe. However, in the discussion that follows, I evidence how the politicization of these elements is grounded on the everyday life. I demonstrate how Vox has been successful in exploiting everyday inequalities and situated narratives of place, mobilizing everyday antagonism. In the first part of the discussion, I'm going to look at these strategies in the Madrilenian working class area of Fortaleza, and then I will finish with some reflections on neighborhood movements and the spatial politics of anti-fascism, drawing on some examples from neighborhood movements in this same area in Hortaleza. So, in this first part of the discussion, as I just said, I argue that Vox's everyday politics of hate are quite relevant to kind of understand the party's electoral success. I focus on Hortaleza, which is a working class neighborhood situated in the outskirts of Madrid, which has two reception centers for unaccompanied migrant minors, mostly coming from Morocco and the Maghreb region. Basically, these centers are sites of institutional exclusion, generally overcrowded, doubling their capacity, and where children are subjected to continuous abuse, police beatings, deportation threats, and the privation of liberty by the authorities. 1 month after the 2019 national elections, an explosive artifact was found at the door of one of these centers, and not by chance. These centers have been key sites for political mobilization by Vox during the campaign and before. And basically, Vox and neo-Nazi groups organizing different demonstrations there, promoting a discourse that situated all the problems of the neighborhood in the centers, linking them to crime, insecurity, unemployment, or the degradation of the neighborhood. So you can find on the screen a photo of the explosive artifact, and also a quote from the head of Vox Madrid, arguing that Vox has the responsibility to protect the ordinary Spaniards that desire freedom and security in the neighborhood, especially in the case of women of all ages that do not dare to walk alone during the night in certain neighborhoods. We came here to talk to the everyday Spanish people who have the right to walk peacefully in the neighborhood without being assaulted by a herd of unaccompanied migrant minors. Well, this is an insightful example to explore the dialectics between everyday politics of hate, institutional racism, and Vox xenophobic populism. Looking at this example, I address in the chapter the co-constitutive relationship between institutional politics and the politics of the street, and I analyze how the far right, rather than mobilizing nationalism, racism, and anti-feminism in abstract terms, they construct situated narratives of place. Indeed, in Hortaleza and in other villages and neighborhoods, Vox is exploiting the inequalities directly produced by the urbanization of border regimes, and the spatialities of institutional racism, and racialization functions here as a powerful mechanism for displacing social responsibility and anxieties in a working class neighborhood that is experiencing the problems of the neoliberal transformations in the post-crisis Madrid, with young people without expectations, commodification of the urban space, or lack of affordable housing. So here in this quote, a neighbor from Hortaleza reflects on how racist terrorism against the children of the center has become normalized with the arrival of Vox political discourses. And basically here, this network shows how the effects and roots of these mobilization strategies go far beyond the electoral success of the party and reach the everyday life and coexistence in the neighborhood. Okay, after this, the last part of my argument addressed the question of the big question of what is to be done. I criticize that most of the literature about far-right politics is simply descriptive, and it does not engage with the question of how to articulate anti-fascist politics on the ground. And here I focus on some of the contributions that the previous spatial analysis of the far right can bring to the articulation of anti-fascist politics. I draw quite a lot on Anthony In's work on anti-fascist geographies, who address the struggle against the far right as a struggle over the spatial articulation. And the core idea here is that once demonstrated how the far right politicize everyday inequalities and narratives, anti-fascist cultures need to be worked from the grassroots. I contend that the neighborhood is a key space to articulate anti-fascist politics, engaging with some powerful examples from neighborhood movements in Hortaleza. So basically, in Hortaleza, after the attack to the unaccompanied minor centers in 2019, several organizations and individuals came together in a joint platform to challenge the discourse and demonstrations of Vox in the neighborhood. So here one member of the platform explains how they created the platform and how they managed to kick out from the neighborhood some leaders of Vox that came to visit the center and came to do political propaganda. And not only that, the platform has not only been countering Vox presence in the neighborhood, but it has been also organizing direct support to the minors in the center. And basically, one line of research that I also developed and that I kind of developed in the chapter is the role of institutional politics in challenging also these kind of far-right politics on a local scale. And basically, neighborhoods, associations and grassroots organizations in Hortaleza account how, while Ahora Madrid was in government with this municipalist experience of the Council of Change, they ignored multiple complaints about migrant children being made homeless by public institutions, alleging lack of power on this issue. And overall, in all the interviews that I did with migrant activists in Madrid back in that time, they kind of criticized how anti-racism was not a priority for the Madrilenian left-wing municipalist experience that emerged from the Indignados movements. And they criticized how institutional racism was perpetuated by the council in various ways, despite we had refugees welcome banner in the council. Racist downrights continued to happen in multicultural neighborhoods like Lavapiés, where the Senegalese man died in 2015, running away from a police control, or where Top Manta campaign, where there was a Top Manta campaign criminalizing street sellers during that time. And basically engaging with these debates, this is something that has been ongoing. Vox have been organizing different demonstrations and presenting their campaigns in working class neighborhoods in Madrid. And these have been challenged by different neighborhood movements, as you can see in the photo. And this was during the, during the last Podemos and PSOE government. And when these things happened in several neighborhoods, what the government did was basically asking people not to come down to the street and not to fall into the provocations of the far right, making bigger the gap between neighborhood movements and anti-fascist neighborhood movements and the institutional responses. So basically, this experience demonstrate how anti-fascism and anti-racism have not always been a priority for left-wing political parties in government, and grassroots politics and neighborhood movements have demonstrated to be a strong political tool in the articulation of alternative politics of belonging and challenging the narratives of place created by Vox. And I think more conversation is needed between the two, between institutional politics and neighborhood movements, as we had before during the Indignados movements and so on. Concluding here, I have argued that we need to move beyond institutional, nation-centered and descriptive analysis of the far right and anti-fascist politics. I have also foreground the centrality of everyday spaces in constituting political identities, alternatives, and solidarities. And I have argued that it's important to situate anti-fascism at the core of left-wing politics, both on an autonomous kind of neighborhood level and also in the institutions. And that's everything. Thank you so much for inviting me to contribute here. And thank you also for your presentations. They were really great.
Thank you, Anna. So thank you all four of you. So